very different from these days. And, you know, it was a time in education, particularly in where I was, where just about anything went. You know, there was a great exploratory atmosphere when I was in school. And people did all kinds of work. There was no one discipline or art being taught. So one felt you could pursue anything you wanted. And the fact that I ended up doing the kind of work I do coming from that atmosphere, I think is a little, it must be what I was meant to do, for better or for worse, because it wasn't the kind of work which was particularly in favor at that time, a more realistic, if you will, viewpoint of things. And so I went to the School of Visual Arts, and I met fantastic people there. I've met people who became my friends for the rest of my life, really, like Harvey Dinnerstein, Herb Katzman. I was an assistant for Louise Bourgeois, who later became a very well-known artist. And I don't regret it at all, really, my years there. Afterwards, I lived a life which I don't think you could live now, of an artist. Basically, you know, getting by. Of course, back then it was much easier to survive on a few $100s than it is now, you know, and you could make your way through the world. And so I spent an awful lot of time. In many ways, my life was reversed in that I spent my retirement years in my 20s and my 30s in terms of having free time. But I made myself work. I mean, I did work a lot of work then, and but on my own schedule. And I thought I would be an illustrator, and I studied illustration at the School of Visual Arts, which were terrific people, the best illustrators in the world, really teaching there. And I found that it wasn't for me as a career. I started doing it the first year or two when I got out of art school, and I just found that I didn't like being told what to do by art directors, and sometimes specifically exactly what to do. It was not for me. And at the same time, there was actually a gallery on Staten Island, Moro Graphics, and some of you may remember that, and it was in New York. And I gave her a couple of my early prints, one of which is on the wall in here, of Richmond Terrace, which, interestingly, I drew it about a few hundred yards away from this building, 50 years ago. So there's a circle connecting everything there, too. So she sold 3 or 4 copies of this print for me within a week or two, and I was really shocked to see that these little things I was doing for myself, drawings, prints, sometimes paintings, people would actually want to buy. And so that began a path of realizing that perhaps I could make some kind of livelihood outside of the commercial art world, and I began to pursue that a little bit, and it was not easy. It certainly was a lot easier than it is now to make money from selling art. We all are in these kind of like little subjective bubbles that we live in, so it's hard to know if the rest of the world feels the same way as you do about things. But I talk with artists. I talk with enough artists to know that the general population today does not collect and does not buy art the way that the older generations did, the people who supported me for many decades. It's a different world after that. But at that point, sales of prints in particular were possible, so I started doing that. And then I started teaching. I first taught at the Art Lab, which is actually from here, early 80s, And then I was offered a part-time job at Wagner College, started teaching at Wagner, got offered the full-time job at Wagner, and did that until 2020. And in that time, I also, of course, at the same time I was doing my own work and doing my best to kind of get it out into the world when I could. And that basically supported me for many, many years. And now I've retired from Wagner. I retired from Wagner in 2019, and I've been teaching at the Art Students League in Manhattan. I teach drawing. And I teach a summer drawing class and workshops that run throughout the year. We've got one coming up in 2 weeks, if anybody's interested. So that's kind of like a big picture, I guess, my story, so to speak. The work you see here in this exhibit was done over a 50-year period. And the oldest ones, I think most of the older pieces are actually in this first room. And as I said, there's a small etching which I did in 1975, just several hundred feet from here across Richmond Terrace. And the landscape hasn't changed all that much if you walk over there. You know, I've always been I'm always gravitating towards landscapes that have, I hate to use the word soul, but I don't know what else I can use. Something that's been around for a while, you know. And sometimes those things tend to be in a state of somewhat of a decay, and that's just what it is. It's not that I love decay, but things attract me or don't attract me, and I'm either pulled into the subject or I'm not. And it isn't really a matter of thought. It's not a matter of thinking or decision making. It's feeling. And if I feel something for a subject, I'm generally, there's like a little, I get this little antenna that says, hey, check this out, you know, this could be worth something. And so a lot of these subjects a lot of these works are the product of that kind of process of simply walking around and looking. Looking is really the indispensable aspect of what I do, or certainly as important as anything else. And you know, if you look at the work, and I guess most of you have, you know, there's not that much change in style from etchings or drawing from 50 years ago to now. Most recent drawing, which is in this room. But I think there has been a deepening of sorts of my choice of subject matter. There's a variety of subjects, as you can see, a variety of techniques and mediums, drawings, paintings, prints, right? And that comes from my own sense of boredom, because if I work in a particular medium for any amount of time, I find I get very bored by it. And I want something new to enliven it, so I'll change the scale and make a big picture, or I'll make a small picture, or I'll paint, you know, on location, or I'll paint in my studio. It's a great variety that I feel you can choose from as an artist. And for me, it's always been kind of a trick I use on myself to keep myself a little bit interested in the work, in staying with it. So I don't know, you know, I could go on. I would prefer to kind of, yeah.
What went into your selection process for this exhibit? I know you have made so many works.
Right. It was interesting because I thought of that line from the song, you know, what to put in and what to leave out. And it was like, what do you want to leave out became the question, you know. And so I worked with Zero and Megan. Who are here somewhere. So we worked together on choosing, and there were a couple of things that they felt strongly about. There were a few things that I felt strongly about, and then there was a big group that we both agreed on. So it kind of worked out that way. And more or less, some things really have sentimental meaning to me, and those were the things that I kind of felt myself more like, if I'm going to have a retrospective of this work, I have to include this because it just means, it may not be my best drawing or painting, but it means something to me personally, you know.
How do you feel, John,
John Noble was unlike anybody else I'd ever known. You know, he was a unique individual, and the drawing I did, John has, and John was born. You know, his parents supposedly met in Renoir's studio, and he was born in Paris. He grew up in Provincetown, which at that point was an actual, real artist colony, and came to New York at the age of like 15 or so with his family, and rejected the entire, as he called it, the smoke-filled rooms of artists discussing philosophy, you know. And he started sailing when he was 16 years old, and I could go on talking about John for like an hour because he was such an interesting character. You know, he's been dead for over 40 years, but he, you know, some people stay with you know, and you feel like they're, you know, like even though it's been many, many, many years since you've seen them, they are fresh in your mind because they've had that imprint, and he was definitely that for me.
So could you just talk us through the process a little bit of how you frame your site? Because I noticed some are really close, and some are back. And then when you talk about going into your studio, I mean, nowadays I'm assuming people take digital photos and work off of that.
Right.
I'm assuming they do
Yeah, I do that sometimes.
Sometimes?
As I get older, I do more and more. And the truth is, it's another subject that can be spoken about at length, because I started doing this work on Staten Island. I first went out in the early 70s to draw on Staten Island. I used to go out way out to Tottenville and Charleston and those areas. And it was going to the wilderness then. It's not the wilderness anymore. And it's actually become hostile in many ways when one contemplates going to draw someplace or paint something. There's hostile might not be the right word, but there's a different feeling about outside, and everybody has their property fenced off now. It used to be you would see an abandoned building somewhere, or what, like an abandoned pier, and you would walk up to it, and you could explore it, you could think about it, you could think about what was this? Why is it empty like this, you know? And so you were specifically asking, like, how do you think of the composition? Is that?
Yeah, to some degree, because I noticed that some of your work is very close up, but then on Silver Lake, it's like a top perspective.
Yeah, I mean,
So
you know, each
how do you
picture
frame that?
dictates kind of like, as I was trying to say, you know, like, in the non-verbal or non-thought based way of approaching it, thinking about what touches me, and then trying to get to it, and trying to keep that image without being distracted and letting all the other things that can come up and pull you away from that singular image stay with it. You know, that's the trick. And so, you know, sometimes, again, you know, like something like that drawing, which was done 40-some years ago, you know, that was easy because, wow, I was interested in the train and you know, and just the whole, I wanted to be close to it. But something like Silver Lake, it was more like wanting to show the context of Manhattan, and I did that before 9/11. You know, I did that. Yeah, that was actually started as a commission. Someone commissioned me to do a drawing of. They wanted 3 drawings of like waterways of Staten Island, how Staten Island relates to the water and the ocean, you know, where we are as an island. And so I did a big charcoal of that, a large charcoal, and then I eventually did a print of it. And but the idea was to show the you know, like residential little Staten Island, and then boom, you know, this thing. And I remember, I feel a little guilty saying this, but I remember drawing that and thinking, God, this world, these towers, they are so ugly. I guess this is just something you're stuck with when you're drawing Manhattan skyline, you know? Because it was so obtrusive in a kind of a way. It was just a thought that passed through my head.
What's the view, where were you when you were?
Standing in the intersection at Silver Lake and a Forest Victory. When there's, yeah. You actually, to get that, you actually have to walk out into the road. So that was done for photographs, yeah.
I have a question. What advice would you have for a young artist trying to make a living in the art world?
Oh my goodness. Go to law school.
I mean, would you, if they're still in school, just starting out, what classes or what would you advise?
I mean, that really depends, you know. It's, I mean, the truth is, you know that quote by Joseph Campbell, you know, follow your bliss. I mean, it's very simple to say that, right? First, you got to figure out what your bliss is, right? I think, and you got to figure out what it is that really attracts you, and that's the tough one, I think, for a lot of people. Today, I can't imagine telling somebody, "Oh, yeah, do what I did." I mean, I would do, in any given time, I'd be working on a portrait of somebody's grandchild. I might be teaching like one class in an afternoon, and I might be, well, I started out, my first job when I got out of art school was I was a delivery man for a fish market, which I loved. And, you know, it was a great part-time job. I did that for like 2 or 3 years when I first got out of school. And, but it got me out into the world and outside, which I much prefer than being, you know, indoors.
Your path is your path. Somebody else.
Yeah, obviously, everyone has to find, I think, their way.
I know, of course, if you go into graphics, a lot of it's being done overseas. You know, there's movies and stuff like that. It's just computer. I don't even think they draw cells anymore. It's all
Animation.
Yeah,
Animation is very, very different than it was. Yeah.
So, Bill, there does seem to be some fascination with decades, all right?
Decades?
Because
For decade.
Well, yeah, all right, okay. But, I mean, you know, I'm particularly fond of this one here near the canal, having grown up in that area. And so much of it has improved since I've been down there. But you do have this sense of appreciation for things and places in decay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that neighborhood, like many years ago, 40 years ago, I remember talking to John Noble, and I think I wrote this in one of those little pieces. And I was telling him I was going to go to Europe, and I wanted to go on a drawing tour through France and Italy. And he said, "Don't go to Europe, Murphy. He said, go to the Gowanus Canal." And it took me a while, but I eventually got there, and I see what he liked about it. And you know, it's a hard thing to, if I don't really stop to delineate it in my mind, but it has to do with the type of forms that are around you, the textures, the feeling of having been lived in, I think, more than anything. And so that etching was the culmination of a few things I had done around that time of the Gowanus Canal. And actually, that play, I drew that on location, which I kind of say with pride because it was not an easy thing to do. You know, if you've ever, I don't know how many people here have ever done any etching, but etching on a plate, and it's very hard to see what you're doing because you're working on a brown ground which has silver underneath it, or copper in that case. And so you're barely making out visually what you're drawing, you know, and it has to do with your experience of having drawn enough to know that if I put this many lines here, it's going to be just dark enough and it won't be over-etched, in which case it'll become gray when you put it in the acid and getting into the technical stuff of etching. But, so I did a drawing of that, exactly, you know, like what I saw, I sat down, spent a couple of days drawing it, came home, and traced the drawing, and then got a copper plate cut exactly to the size that I wanted, and transferred my drawing onto my plate, went back to Brooklyn, and sat and etched for life. So that really helped me a lot, and if I did it all, you know, by cold sitting there.
And aside from the ability to make prints from your etchings, was there a reason you had a preference to do etchings other than working with pen and ink?
I think it's a different thing. I think the look of it is different. There's something about the plate tone. Like if you look at, for instance, there's two prints there. There's one right behind Roxanne. There's these. So plate etchings, the lightest light will still be darker than the white of the paper because there's a very thin layer. Even if you wiped it and wiped it and wiped it, there's a very thin layer of ink which is going to remain. And I suppose you could get it to be pure white, but most of my etchings don't get quite there. So that warmth of the plate tone is can be a nice thing to use in the image. And of course there's some of these prints I've sold, 50 or 100 of. The one of Silver Lake is in the Smithsonian Museum. It's in the 9/11 Museum. It's in the New York Historical Society, the New York Transit Museum. It's in probably 5 or 6 public collections. So I think that, doing that with drawings would be difficult. It's much easier to sell a print than it is to sell a drawing, in my experience. And it has nothing to do with price. There's something about the print that seems to be more of a finality. It gives it a finality that a pencil drawing doesn't have.
And people also like the fact that when you number them,
Yeah.
it's like having a collectible item.
Oh, yeah. People want this number, but can I get an artist's proof? That kind of thing. And it's all the same because you could have printed number 1, it could have been the last print you made if you printed the whole edition at once. So people don't realize that. Yes.
In terms of focus, this body of work is all obviously nautical,
Maritime, yeah.
maritime. So is there a whole bunch of other prints that are about supermarkets or about...
I just did my first supermarket. But actually it's a shop.
Yeah, in other words, obviously for this place, these make sense, but is there...
Well, if you don't know my work, and you should take a look at it, it's at a website. I have a website called theburninglight.com.
Okay, right.
I do portraits, I do figure drawings, I do landscapes, I do everything but basically still life, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm asking because I'm a nautical person, whether there's an emotionality to this collection.
Well, it's a funny thing because I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but it was only maybe 10 years ago that the thought hit me, I live on an island. And that makes you very different than somebody in Iowa or Texas or wherever. It's like you take these things as you grow up, you grow through them as a small child. You don't stop to think about it. But living on an island, I think, has created, and we could get into a psychoanalysis of Staten Island in general, which we're not going to do. But we could, and that would be very interesting because I think a lot of its psyche, collective psyche, comes from that island mentality. Not mentality, but it's the background of being on an island, And so being on an island also, you see all this waterfront stuff. And my grew up in Great Kills, not far from the old waterfront, which had a lot of things not that different from this stuff. When I discovered this neighborhood, Kreischer, this was like 2006, and it was in its very last stage, in my mind, before it totally became developed. And they had cleared the ground out enough that I could see these old vessels that had been unearthed, that had been there since the Depression. And I was very excited when I found it, and it was, I spent about 2 years there, driving down and spending as much time as I could. And those days really are very fresh in my mind. The sunlight on these vessels in the water was a very, very strong experiences, relating to what we were saying about, these things having a particular type of density and soul that they accrue over decades of being in the water, being on the earth, So Kreischerville was a great time. I look back on that time in my mind